Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's podcast, Forber-Pratt, Deputy Executive Director of Children's Emergency Relief International, joins us on the one-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine to discuss orphans and family separation in that country. We've got some interesting headlines as well to run through this week. But before we get to that, just a quick plug for some great online events we have coming up for listeners who are interested in all things New York. So, first event, March 6th, we're going to have a great online conversation entitled Mental Health at the Crossroads. There is a significant class action lawsuit that's been filed against the state of New York for shortcomings and barriers that are involved in its provision of community mental health services to youth. We're going to talk about that lawsuit, understand a little bit about what they're asserting in that lawsuit and what litigants are asking for. We're also going to have a few panelists there to talk about the ways in which problems and shortcomings in community mental health relate downstream to impacts and effects on both the juvenile justice system, institutionalization in the mental health system, and then, of course, in foster care as well. Then on March 23rd, we're going to have another session where panelists with lived experience in New York City's foster care system join our Youth Voices Rising team to talk about whether two recent reforms on the juvenile justice and child welfare front, New York State's Raise the Age reform, which upped the age of the juvenile justice system in the state from 16 to 18, and then the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is a national child welfare reform that in part aimed to basically incentivize states to move away from the use of congregate care and group homes. So the discussion will be with panelists with lived experience about whether those two reforms, the Raise the Age on the state level and Family First on the national level, have improved things for youth in the state's foster care system. I'm going to include the registration links to both of those for anybody who is interested in the show notes for this episode. And if you can't make it on March 6th or you can't make it on March 23rd for those great conversations in person and live, you should still register. We will send you the recording to consume at your leisure. All right, so let's start out headlines with some diffuse news around Capitol Hill, the biggest potentially coming in the form of a Biden administration action around kinship supports for foster care. So what the Biden administration did was put out what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is basically suggesting a change in policy or a clarification to federal guidelines around the issuance of money, in this case, the Title 4E child welfare entitlement. When it's a notice of proposed rulemaking, that means there's going to be a review period. They're going to get comments from the public, and then they will move towards finalization. So what did this kinship notice of proposed rulemaking do? I'm going to read directly from it and try to kind of walk through why it's significant. So what they are proposing to do is to allow each child welfare agency, they call it a Title 4E agency, so that's the state agency that receives, the federal entitlement money for foster care prevention, for adoption subsidies. They're going to allow that Title 4E agency, and I'm quoting here from the rule, to adopt foster family home licensing or approval standards for foster family homes of individuals related to a child by blood, marriage, or adoption, and other individuals who have an emotionally significant relationship with the child, including fictive kin, that differ from non-relative foster family homes agency standards. So We'll stop there and walk through that first and then get to the other significant part of this rule. What they're saying here is that states would be allowed to create two kind of dual track processes for licensing or approving, whatever vernacular they want to use, non-relative foster homes who become licensed to sort of become foster parents for the state, and a second track for people who are there to provide foster care for a specific child they are related to, they have a family relationship with, they're a family friend or a neighbor of the child. And there's a second piece of this. So the notice of rulemaking would also allow the Title IV-E agency, the State Child Welfare Agency, to claim Title IV-E federal financial participation for the cost of foster care maintenance payments on behalf of an otherwise eligible child who is placed in a relative or kinship licensed or approved foster family home when the agency uses different licensing or approval standards. So this ties the money to what they were saying in the beginning. Basically, they're saying it's okay to have a different process by which you approve or license kin compared to your stable of non-relative foster homes. So you can create a track where some of the different standards that you might have for your non-relative foster homes, for example, maybe a state wouldn't allow bunk beds to be used or had a certain amount of square feet, or each child had to have a separate room to get licensed. Those things would not need to be in your plan as a state for licensure or approval of kinship homes. And this is the important thing about the money, that would not stop a state from being able to seek reimbursement through the 4E entitlement for those placements with approved kin who go down that different track. So here's why this is significant. There have been legal advocates and people in this space of children and parents' rights and child welfare reform who have felt for a long time that this has always been allowable. It's always been okay for states to essentially, approve of a relative's home in a different way than they would have a non-relative and pay them accordingly, support them financially to care for a child that the state has deemed needs to be removed from their home. This proposed rule that the Biden administration is putting forward here would really take any sort of mystery about that out and make it very clear once and for all that there can be a separate track to approve and license kin, and that's an important distinction too. You wouldn't have to make relatives go through the exact same or really any licensure plan. You could have just a simple approval plan, and you can use the federal reimbursement to help pay for supporting those relatives. But it is important to also note that this guidance, these rules, do not mandate that any state actually create a different process for approving kinship, nor does it require them to seek out 4E payments or to provide a foster care maintenance payment of any kind, whether it's state or federally shared, to any of these parents. So really what this rule, the best way to look at it is that if it gets finalized, it sets the table for advocates, for people in various states and state leaders who really believe in a fundamental shift towards increasing the percentage of youth who are in foster care living with kin, with fictive kin, with family. It is setting the table for them to make that case more strongly at the state. But if no states really get enthusiastic about this or embrace what they're trying to do here with this rule, it will not have had an effect. It is worth noting that the administration, at least, seems to believe that there would be some uptake pretty quickly on this because they project the cost of this rule to be $3 billion over 10 years. So that's about $300 million a year in extra costs that they are projecting will occur as a result of states drawing down more money to pay relative caregivers. But just to illuminate the point about this not necessarily being a done deal, there is sort of a local kind of regional proxy for what the Biden administration is doing here, and that came in the form of a lawsuit called Dio versus Glisson. This was a Kentucky case. So it's in the 4th Federal Circuit District, which are the 6th Circuit, which I believe is Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, and Tennessee. So what happened in this class action lawsuit is the circuit court ruled that, Kentucky was basically creating an uneven playing field for kin, and that if they approved kin to be foster parents, they ought to be paid a foster care payment just like any other non-relative would. Now, so why this is an interesting proxy for what will play out potentially if this rule gets finalized now on the national level is that is a federal court, a federal circuit court instructing all the states in that district, you have got to abandon whatever you're doing if it's not equitable between kin and non-relatives and come up with a new scheme. And now some of these states have moved a little bit more vigorously towards that level playing field. Michigan stands out. Kentucky has attempted to create a new kind of scheme in which relatives are compensated more, are supported more directly from the child welfare system when they take children in. Ohio moved to change its policies, but then was brought into court by children's rights and several other litigants because the feeling was that they were sort of putting lipstick on a pig. They weren't really creating anything equitable there and providing a pretty minimal amount of support going to relatives versus what a non-relative caregiver who is fully licensed by the state would get. So this is all to just say, assuming that this is finalized, it really has the potential to clear up and create the kind of stable ground for states to legislate around different processes that more closely respect and honor the contributions of relatives who step up and are willing to care for kids that the state has decided cannot safely stay in their homes. Last note on this actually is that while this rulemaking is not something that needs to be reviewed by Congress, the Biden administration has proposed in its budget asks, perhaps Congress will take this on or consider it, a plan which would actually increase the financial contribution of the federal government when it comes to kinship placement compared to non-relatives and especially to group homes. In a thumbnail, what would happen is if Congress actually acted on what Biden asked for in this budget, that the matching rate that came to states through the 4E system for kin would go up by several percentage points. The non-relative foster homes would get reimbursed at the same rate that they are now. And then congregate care providers, group homes, institutions, those would be reimbursed at a lower rate than is the current standard. I'll drop a link to that story that we wrote up when Biden made that ask in the budget in the show notes. I'll also include Michael Fitzgerald's great reporting on this new proposed kinship plan from the Biden administration. I'll also include Michael's interview with January Contreras, who's Biden's top child welfare official. She talked to Michael about kinship policies, about legal counsel for kids, and several other priorities that the Biden administration has on the child welfare front. A few other quick things from Capitol Hill before we move on to some research news and some local stuff. We mentioned on the podcast a couple of weeks back that the feds have put together a sole grant plan where they were going to give one recipient up to $10 million over 5 years to sort of work with states on improving the differentiation between the circumstances of poverty and cases of, quote unquote, willful neglect. So helping to kind of tease that out. So since we deem that worth mentioning to you, it is also kind of on us to mention that they have since canceled that plan for the grant. The comment that the Administration for Children and Families provided to the Imprint was that upon further examination of funding levels for the 2023 fiscal year, the Children's Bureau determined funding was not available for this particular project. So kind of unclear to me whether that means they thought they had money that they ended up not, or they had less overall kind of discretionary money to use for projects and decided to put the money towards something else. In either circumstance, it seems that that plan is not going to happen. And then one last thing from Capitol Hill, the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Human Rights has launched an investigation into Georgia's foster care system Seemingly of interest to the subcommittee here is more information on Georgia's policies as they relate to investigating and acting on claims of abuse and neglect, particularly for purported teenage victims, and then also the practice that has popped up in many states of hoteling, of keeping older youth in hotels and in some cases in office buildings because they don't have another safe option in the congregate care context or in the foster home context that are willing to take youth in. A little bit of an odd one. I don't think I have ever seen a federal congressional subcommittee take a specific interest in one state and their child welfare operation like this. I'm sure that there are instances where that's happened before. So if you know of one, give me a history lesson. Email me at tips@imprintnews.org and let me know about it. It is possible, just from the phrasing in the letter, that they will not be stopping at Georgia. Certainly the issue of children living without, a true placement is of issue in plenty of other states, Washington for sure, Texas for sure, Illinois, and many others. The two signatories on the letter were Senator John Ossoff of Georgia and Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, which has always also been having some struggles with its foster care system. So I guess if you were laying a bet on who might be next to get interrogated by this subcommittee, look at Tennessee. A dearth of data often confounds efforts to separate reality and perception when it comes to the juvenile justice system, youth committing crimes, related issues to that. And politicians, and to some extent the media, are often quick to affix a big starring role to youth when there's a spike in crime, particularly in violent crime. And, then that can threaten any reforms aimed at treating more youth, as opposed to involving them in the adult criminal justice system. So this subject's been front and center in New York City of late, where just a year and change ago, Mayor Eric Adams sought some rollbacks of the state's Raise the Age law, which was a long-sought legislative reform that brought the state of New York's age of juvenile justice up from 16 to 18. So before that reform was put into place, if you were a 16 or a 17-year-old and you were arrested in New York, really anywhere in the state, you were viewed in the eyes of the law to be an adult no matter what. So the Research and Evaluation Center of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice looked at arrests for felony dangerous weapons and other similar charges as a way to sort of examine whether over time the state and city's juvenile justice reforms, particularly Raise the Age, have coincided with more juvenile crime being committed. And based on the data that they surfaced for this, the answer would be a firm no. So what the researchers did was plot 2006, 2014, and 2022 data around arrests for felony dangerous weapon charges and for felony assault charges. And they broke this into groups 17 and younger, 18 to 24, and 25 and older. And what you can see very clearly is that for the group of 17 and younger, since 2006, the number of youth who have been arrested for felony dangerous weapon charges in these given years has dropped, and the percentage of all arrests from this group have dropped as well. So just to take the felony dangerous weapon charges, in 2006 there were 652 people who were 17 or younger arrested on those charges. By 2014 it was 535. Raise the Age starts to roll out not too long after that, and by 2022 there are 454 youth 17 or younger who are arrested. And the respective percentage of arrests for felony dangerous charges in 2006, this group accounted for 11% of those arrests. That was 9% in 2014. By 2022 they account for 8% of all of these arrests. So I'm just going to quote from Jeff Butts, who is the director of the Research and Evaluation Center. As researchers, we rarely have exactly the right data to prove a theory is true, but we can sometimes use available data to show the theory is probably false. This study shows there is not enough evidence to prove that Raise the Age legislation led to a rise in juvenile violent crime. Some more on the research front. The Imprint published a great rundown last month by Amanda Abrams about the mounting evidence connecting increased cash benefits with less child welfare involvement for families. You can add to that now the latest work from Georgia Tech's Lindsay Rose Bullinger, who has joined us a while back on the podcast, along with her colleague Angela Boy, studying the nexus of the COVID-era child tax credits with child abuse and neglect. So before I explain what Bollinger and Boy found, just as a refresher, during the pandemic, passage of the American Rescue Plan Act, which was kind of the first stimulus under the Biden administration, they created what was called the advanced child tax credits. It upped the number of dollars per child, particularly for older youth. And it also created an advanced system where instead of receiving it at tax time, the money was paid out monthly, I think starting from July of 2021 going in towards the end of the year. So what Bollinger and Boyd did was took a fairly large region of emergency departments in Georgia, hospitals, and contrasted the 4 days following the disbursement of a child tax credit payment with visits made to those hospitals in the same time frame in years prior, and to visits made in the days leading up to payments. So they're looking at in the days following the disbursement of a child tax credit payment, do you see any notable change in arrivals to the emergency department that are clearly connected to child abuse or neglect? So in the 4 days after monthly payments were made, such visits temporarily decreased by 22% compared to the 2 weeks prior, and they were lower than the same time period in the prior years as well. And then also important to note in this is that this seemingly profound, effect disappears really quickly. So there's this 22% decline in that 4-day window. After that 4-day window, it quickly rises back to the same pace. So just quoting from the report and the findings from the authors, because experiencing material hardship is associated with child maltreatment, we expect that these child tax credit payments to also be associated with child abuse and neglect in the short run by potentially reducing material hardship, reducing parental stress, and improving family functioning. All right, this is going kind of long, but I'm going to try and whip through some more headlines because there's been some interesting stuff of late. Here's a couple interesting state-level developments. There's a bill introduced in New York State, going back there for a minute, that would establish something called the Child and Wellbeing Fund, which is described as a flexible funding system that would bolster community assets and create opportunities to fund new programs in historically underfunded communities that are particularly vulnerable to child welfare system involvement. So bringing out of the policy speak for a minute, what the aim is to take particularly impoverished parts of New York where there has been a high rate of child welfare involvement and really just directly infuse financial support into those communities for communities to devise and conceive of ways in which to work with families to support them to keep kids safe without any intervention or any intermingling at all with child welfare agencies. So we'll continue to report on that bill as it moves through the New York legislature, if it in fact does that. Another one we're keeping an eye on down Interstate 95 in Maryland is a bill that could make Maryland the first state to adopt what's called a rebuttable presumption that protects domestic violence victims from neglect allegations. So what a rebuttable presumption is basically an idea that is assumed to be true absent contrary evidence to it. And in applying that to the situation at hand, basically it is currently possible to charge a parent with neglect simply for the act of remaining with an abusive partner and leaving the child in that home. What this legislation would do is to basically say it is not neglect for an abuse survivor to stay in a relationship with an abusive partner or continue to live with them unless there was contrary evidence brought up to demonstrate to the court why there was a neglectful situation going on. So it would be possible that a bill like this could have far-reaching impact. The research, a recent 2019 study that was published in the Children and Youth Services Review, found that domestic violence is a factor in roughly 1 in 5 substantiated cases of abuse and neglect. Now, it didn't go into or parse how many times domestic violence was the only factor, and that would certainly be the cases in which this rebuttable presumption would play in most significantly. There's no other foundation for arguing that a parent was neglectful except for that they're staying with a partner who is abusive to them, living with that person. In this case, you'd have to prove a reason why that would be construed to be neglect. The rebuttable presumption would be that it is not. I think we'll wrap headlines up there. There are a bunch of really great Imprint news stories that I want to talk about, but since we're already at the 25-minute mark here, let's get to those next week. When we come back, our interview with Ian Forber-Pratt.
This episode is sponsored by Creating a Family. Creating a Family is a national nonprofit whose mission is to strengthen and inspire adoptive, foster, and kinship parents and the professionals who support them in raising children exposed to trauma. Creating a Family offers expert-based and trauma-informed resources and training for parents and professionals. To learn more, visit creatingafamily.org. That's creatingafamily.org.
We are joined today for the second time by Ian Forber-Pratt, who is the Deputy Executive Director for Children's Emergency Relief International, which is based in Texas but serves children and families all over the world. So last time we had Ian on, it was actually just a week or so before Russia invaded Ukraine, creating one of the great displacements of children and families in recent history. So we actually did not talk about that on the podcast because that did not happen yet. So this week marks 1 year since Russia invaded the nation to its west. And I know Ian has been, working with people in that region. So today we're just going to focus mostly on what has happened in this, truly horrific year of war in that region. So Ian, thanks for joining us again on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Yeah, John, thank you so much. Thanks for everything you're putting out there in the world. And I'm grateful and disheartened to have to share this information.
For sure, but I think our listeners are really curious about what's going on out there, and I just know that you've got the goods. You do some of the work in the region, and I just know that you're plugged into everything. Just to recap your choices on the on favorites, because we make everybody get favorites. Last time you said you recommended the children's book Narwhal and Jelly because you were reading it with your kid, and the TV show Suits. So I won't make you go again if you don't want, but if you have any recommendations for the people on the TV, movie, music, or book front, feel free.
Yes. So on the book front, again, I'm basing it towards those parents that have kind of, graphic novel age kids. There's a series that we've discovered called High-Low that we are all about by Jude Winick. And it's quite the wonderful graphic novel series. So that's great. And then I'm a country music listener. Morgan Wallen is my favorite right now. So that's been pretty great.
There you go. Let's start here because, I think the majority of what people know about is that there was a Russian invasion that obviously completely displaced a ton of people, particularly women and children. We're going to get to that in a minute. But I think what people are not quite as aware of is that before anything happened with this conflict, Ukraine already had one of the largest populations of orphans in the world, as defined by children living, in what we traditionally view as an orphanage or other group settings. I believe the number I saw in a report was 90,000 kids, and about half of them with disabilities. So can you talk about, to the extent you know about this, what's happened with those children, in the early stanzas of the war and what's happened to them since? Like, how did the response mobilize to keep, those children who were already in an orphanage situation safe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to take it up to 30,000 feet quickly. So all of the post-Soviet bloc countries around Ukraine, when they were controlled, occupied, run by the Soviet Union, there were baby houses, basically, huge institutions, like nothing you've ever thought of. And the quality of those ranged from everything that you can think of, abysmal to actually, children safe and hygienically clean, but still mass institutionalized, which is never good for a child. As all of those countries became independent, their governments did variations on a theme of what the US has done in many countries around the world, is deinstitutionalized and then focused on family. Ukraine had, you're absolutely right, the number that I see most often is 100,000 of children that were in institutions. And before the invasion happened, Ukraine was beginning to deinstitutionalize. They had begun to pass foster care legislation. The European Union was pushing for this idea called opening the doors of institutions and getting children into families. And so that work was beginning, still one of the largest numbers of kids in institutions, but it was beginning. And then boom, the pandemic hit. And what happened around the world and in Ukraine was that the government had said, hey, we can't have all these kids in one physical place. let's speed up. The term we're using in the global field is rapid reintegration, which is not a good thing. Maybe the idea of kids going back with family is good, but rapid reintegration without preparation is a disaster. So many kids were dropped off with family members at the beginning of the pandemic. But then when the conflict started, then you had numbers of women and children fleeing, bringing sometimes their neighbors' children and other children with them. So as you mentioned before, this unbelievable displacement in the region. But then there was a moderate amount of children that popped back into those institutions, and they have become trapped because they didn't have anyone to take them out of the country. So the children in those institutions right now are some of the most vulnerable, especially in the areas of conflict, because as an area gets invaded or bombed or whatever, those children are trapped there. And you're totally right. The proportion of children with disabilities is quite huge as well.
Which I would imagine makes it harder to be untrapped. I mean, it would be one thing if it was a bunch of kids who would be relatively mobile to get them out, but I imagine that complicates things when you have medically complex cases and mass.
Absolutely.
Like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's so scary. And are you saying that that's still the case now, a year later? Most of the children who were in institutions in Ukraine are still in those institutions? Have
100%.
not left? Wow.
The positive is that all of the aid groups and UNICEF and the UNHCR and all of these groups are talking deeply about the importance of family-based care, but actually realizing it with a social workforce that is also in active trauma has been a more difficult thing than you can put on paper.
This is a potentially stupid question, but is there to some extent awareness on the part of the Russians of where these places are? I mean, is there at least an informal agreement of any kind of where these institutions are full of really vulnerable kids so that they aren't hurt? Or
yeah, I mean, the best I can do anecdotally is that it seems like maybe there would be some discussion of it, but in actual practice, there's anyone is fair game right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, so awful. So like you said, that is just the children who were already orphans to some extent domestically before any of this started. Let's talk about the flow of children and families that have been displaced and in some cases probably orphaned as a consequence of this war. And I guess even moving the step before that, the estimates are that there's been about 6,700 civilians killed in this war already, and 6% of those are children, 424 of them. So for the children who have not passed away, I mean, do we have a sense of how many children have lost their parents? And, can you talk about what process has propped up over the last year to figure out, family displacement and connecting families back if they are separated? Like what has been going on sort of behind the scenes with your group and other NGOs to kind of make sure that this goes as well as it possibly can in such a chaotic situation?
Absolutely. So in the show notes, I've sent along the UNHCR tracking portal, which is updated daily. So the where people are is fairly well tracked. The issue is that of a recent survey that we can also put in the show notes that had over 43,000 respondents from different countries that are hosting refugees, 78% of the people on the move are separated from immediate family, and many of them don't necessarily know the status of them. Communication's going back and forth, but the idea that people have scattered, that parents are separated from their kids, and the thing that I never truly understood is that kids have been separated from their primary caretakers because they went with a neighbor or with somebody else. And now we're a year out and people are just kind of hunkering down in their own little islands where they are in their countries. And most of the people who responded, 63%, said that they don't plan to go back to Ukraine. So what that does is it makes it really difficult to actually report on how many children are with their families and how many children's parents exist or don't exist. The one thing we do know is that it's a very small percentage of kids that are unaccompanied minors. They're mostly with somebody, an adult, that has assumed the role of primary caretaker. So we can kind of take that as it is. It's kind of positive.
Yeah, I think that is a pretty positive thing. So if I'm hearing you right, the majority of people in general who have left the Ukraine are women because most men have stayed behind. And if I'm hearing you,
87%.
yeah, and if
80%
I'm
of them are women.
right, and if I'm
Right.
hearing you right, the majority of those women are either with their children or know where their children are.
Correct.
There is a low incidence of truly, I am here and I don't know where my child is
Yeah,
on this continent.
absolutely correct. Yep. It's
Okay.
more the psychological, social kind of adaptation, people that have no idea when they're going home. And the best way to say it, although maybe a little crass, is that the honeymoon period's over. So what's happened is that these women and children have, moved on to a different country, and people have opened up their doors. Landlords have opened up their facilities and they took people in, but they thought it would be for a couple of weeks. And now, a year on, income is waning. People have used up their savings, and the kids are not getting the schooling that they need. Everybody is traumatized. And what I'm seeing, which I don't think that we acutely can feel in the West, I know that's a big statement, is that the impact on children and families, especially children, is getting worse by the day. And we hear of a new Russian offensive that's being planned. But the biggest problem is that they don't know the end of it. And this number, again, that I'll say here, 63% plan on staying in their current home country, but 74% are not exactly sure if they'll ever return home.
So that's the majority of the children who have left Ukraine are in the situation you just described, which is with a parent, with a family, but struggling, understandably, with everything that's happening. For that small number of youth, but I would imagine significant, who have lost parents, lost both parents, what is the international response been? Where are they mostly? How are they being served? Do we know
Yes, we
anything
do
about
know.
that? Yeah.
We do know, absolutely. So UNICEF and UNHCR kind of led the force of the initial kind of where do people go. So the UNHCR had these kind of reception centers, and then UNICEF has a thing called the blue dots. And those blue dots basically kind of log and support and help unaccompanied minors, kids that are separated, go to local partners who have all of the case management lean of everything. So they work with Moldovan government, Polish government, Ukrainian government to case manage, work with, find foster families for those children. So to be honest with you, the case work and the social work is actually going as best as it could, knowing that those systems are still developing in each country.
Ian referenced a couple of resources he passed along. I will definitely put those in the show notes. And one of them kind of shows the path of people in general out of Ukraine. It seemed, if I was understanding it right, like to be a fairly even split, to be people seeking refuge in Europe and those who are now in Russia. Do we know anything about the outcomes or the situation of Ukrainian families who have gone in that direction?
Yeah, I wish I did. I don't
Yeah.
have anything to report
That's
on
sort of a
that.
black box, I would
Yep.
think. Yeah. What role, if any, has the United States played in all this? I mean, obviously, we are extremely entrenched in supporting the Ukrainians in their war effort. That's on the headlines every day. How we're involved with the military actions. But what are we doing on this front with children and families?
Yeah, humanitarian aid wise, and also just kind of staffing up and supporting, there have been a number of organizations, including ours, that have either stood up programs. So, for example, we stood up an emergency case management program in Moldova. We've served 487 households and helping them have access to resources. And we're a small drop in the bucket. So, there have been large organizations that have put either just funds into the effort coordinated by UNHCR and UNICEF in each country, or there have actually been organizations that have opened up an office or a branch or supported a local organization. because the coordination efforts have been pretty wonderful in each of the countries around international organizations and local organizations working together to support children and families. And although it's kind of logical, it's really important to mention here that these organizations have been focusing on the most kind of air quotes vulnerable children with disabilities, children, of course, that are separated or unaccompanied, and then the SOGI or LGBTQAI plus populations. Because already in that area, there isn't an acceptance for gender fluidity. And so that's a really big deal as well. So there's been some specific big infusions of funds from organizations in the US to support those populations to keep them from trafficking, because trafficking has become huge. The predators are out and about.
So they're in the surrounding countries, like they have viewed
Yep,
this.
although they're in Ukraine as well. There's no doubt in the slightest.
Oh man.
Because the infrastructure is so compromised.
Yeah.
And so, getting to the victims, unfortunately, is much easier. And you've got a traumatized group of professionals that are taking care of young people as well.
I appreciate you coming on to kind of tell us what you know about what's going on in that area, but I'd be a fool to let you leave without tapping into your expertise and know-how about what else is going on in the world. So what is Siri? What are you up to, across the globe? Anything interesting to report?
Yeah. So one of the greatest acute needs right now is in the country of Sri Lanka, which is off of the coast, the south coast of India. And Sri Lanka is almost famine crisis. The government itself defaulted on all of their loans, and inflation is seen oftentimes at 300% or more. And we're seeing significant institutionalization of children. And so luckily ourselves and UNICEF have been asked by the government to reform the entire system, write all the legislation, train social workers and parasocial workers. And so that's been something we're in the throes of. But it's beyond what I can imagine. I mean, our staff is cooking with firewood instead of fuel. And it's
just so I understand it, because you went from the economic situation to the institutionalization, are they very closely correlated? Is the reason for this enormous spike in institutionalization because you have a lot of parents that feel they can't care and keep their kids fed? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's out of love. I mean, I think that's an important thing to note. We see this institutionalization of children around the world most often due to loving parents. One of the terms, which is not so politically correct, is the idea of a social orphan. The idea that kid has a mother and father and a family around, but just because they're saying, gosh, we cannot provide this kid education, food, basic needs, the kid's better off in a big institution. And that's the main driver around the world for institutionalization.
Yeah. Can I ask you about, some issues around our southern border? Because I know that you guys have some involvement in supporting children who come through with the unaccompanied children's program, which I will not belabor the explanation of this, but generally when children from other countries that aren't Mexico, so Central America and other countries, seek asylum at our border, old school, we used to have our border patrol deal with that. In the last 15, 20 years, that's kind of changed to they hand them to the Health and Human Services Department, who shelters them, feeds them, supports them until they can find a sponsor inside the country, and then they go through the asylum process in the country. That's how it's supposed to work, right? I think people have a sense of of growing pressure at our border in terms of immigration and asylum seeking, but just to give folks the numbers on just this unaccompanied children's program. In 2012, HHS received about 13,000 kids. Last year it was 128,000, almost 129,000. So the size of this thing has exploded and the budget has exploded. I guess I'm curious for your sense of whether you see that as a continuing trajectory that we're on, if there's any suggestion of it plateauing or declining, and then I kind of have a follow-up on some new supports that were put into the budget last year. But what's your general sense of the trends in that program?
Right. I'm acutely aware of this. Thank you for asking. So we are increasing our office in Guatemala this year, meaning last year, 2022, alone, we trained Guatemalan government officials on reintegration work, foster care work, all of those things, and we'll continue to do so. The answer to your question is, I'm not a pessimist, I promise, but I don't see an end in sight because the source issues are not fully not addressed really.
Yeah.
So you're seeing children multiple times. So say, for example, they do go through the process that you mentioned, but then they cannot find a sponsor and they're back in country. They're sent again and they're going multiple times. And the drug cartels and the poverty and just the kind of social workforce are all things that need to be stood up in all of these sending countries, so to speak.
Yeah, fighting drug cartels is what he meant there.
Yes.
We don't need to stand up drug cartels.
No, I'm so sorry. Please reframe that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so it is quite something, and the source issues really need to be addressed in a big way before we're going to see a plateau or a decline.
Ian Forber-Pratt, Deputy Executive Director for Children's Emergency Relief International. We appreciate you coming on here, schooling us on everything going on in Ukraine, Sri Lanka too. That was some bonus info. Thanks for downloading on that and everything else. But thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I am so grateful.
Thanks to Ian Forber-Pratt, Deputy Executive Director of Children's Emergency Relief International, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. You just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And if you'd like to reach us over email, you can do so at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.